Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I spoke with Patrick Graff, a senior fellow at the American Federation for Children, the nation's largest school choice advocacy organization. We discussed his executive summary and recent article, which asserts that public schools in high competition areas saw gains and positive effects instead of the often claimed negative effects. Patrick claims this competition effect was found to be 11 times more cost-effective than simply increasing school spending. Our conversation unpacked some of my questions about his assertions and the school choice movement in general, including the need to ensure minimum academic quality and accountability in schools. As always, I encourage you to visit wegrowteachers.com for more information about our professional learning and development. Our spring, summer, and fall is starting to book up, but please do reach out if you'd like to learn more about how we can help with project-based learning, knowledge-rich inquiry, differentiation, civics education, and more. We're also beginning to fill up the second cohort for our PBL Grow 26 event in Louisville this June. That and much more is available at wegrowteachers.com, or feel free to email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. Now, here's my conversation with Patrick. I am with Patrick Graff. He's a senior fellow at the American Federation for Children. I want to give him the opportunity, as I usually do, to introduce himself and talk about AFC and that kind of thing. But first of all, welcome. Glad to have you here. Let's kind of dive into it here. Patrick, what's your story? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the American Federation for Children before we get into the meat of the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. I come to education as a former teacher. So I taught third grade at a Catholic school down in Tampa, Florida. And that's where I really started my education career, is in the classroom with 28 kids for a full year, trying to figure out, what it is to impart learning to these 7 and 8 year olds. And honestly, that has been one of the most formative parts of my whole career. And I think really prepped me for not only presenting and research, because I eventually went on and worked for a teacher training program, and then got a PhD in sociology, where I studied education and statistics. So my background is really in analyzing education data now and presenting on research. And now working at AFC as a senior fellow, I advise our government affairs teams on research and school choice policy. And we are the country's largest school choice advocacy organization, and are really interested in extending opportunity to all kids across the country to be able to choose the educational option that fits best for them, whether that's a public school, charter school, magnet school, private schools, home schools, having a variety of options open for the many different needs out there for kids.
Okay, and I don't know when it was maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 years ago. I probably should have looked it up, but I think I spoke with Shaka Mitchell, right?
Yeah, that's right.
From the AFC about some of these things, but you've got a new piece out in Ed Week and a sort of study or paper that goes with it. You mentioned teacher training. What was that? So tell me more about that work.
Yeah, so I love that. And honestly, it totally informed what I ended up doing most of my research on in graduate school. But I worked for, so up here in South Bend, where I live now, University of Notre Dame has a teacher training program where you take new college graduates. It's a Master's of Education program where we're training them up, sending them into schools, and actually assigning them to schools around the country. So I got to see many different classrooms, which I loved. I got to travel all across the United States and probably saw 150 different classrooms with beginning career teachers in them, which was really fascinating, especially having come directly from the classroom, because, there you only know your school, you only know your classroom primarily. But in that role, I was able to see very different grade levels and environments, from Oakland, California to Tucson to Indianapolis. We were even Peoria, Illinois for a time, got to spend some time in Peoria. So that was, it was exciting, and I really enjoyed it. But that was kind of my background, working with early career teachers, and especially ones in that first year of teaching, which can be really difficult.
So they were first year teachers in the classroom, and this was building on their existing sort of pre-service program?
That's right. So this was, the program that Notre Dame runs is an alternative certification program where they take classes during the summer, and then during the school year, they teach in Catholic schools around the country. So because of that Notre Dame connection, it sends these folks out to schools around the country. And interestingly, it really replaced, the Catholic school system, if you think historically, was largely staffed by these incredible women, the nuns, that you hear about in the stories about Catholic
Wrapping
schools.
the kids on the knuckles
That's
with
right.
rulers.
Right. Yeah, bringing that strong discipline to the Catholic school world. But, unfortunately, many of those nuns are no longer in our Catholic schools. A lot of them have retired, don't have the same folks there. So Notre Dame really kind of stepped in to help fill that need. And so a lot of our teachers are actually in some of those same schools, sometimes living in the convents that the nuns used to live in at these schools, smaller buildings, to basically kind of prepare the next generation of Catholic school teachers.
Well, it's interesting. If you would indulge me here, lingering on this a little bit more, because we work with teachers and professional learning, and we hear a lot, and this might actually be a good segue into the school choice kind of conversation. We hear a lot about the lack of quality in teacher prep programs. Most teachers, I think, and anecdotally, but say their teacher prep wasn't particularly great. There's of course the political aspersions that people really get worked up about. I think there's some truth to that, and probably some hyperbole there, that kind of thing. So I'm curious, one, what you saw in terms of those sort of first year teachers and their readiness and preparedness, and what they have learned. Like science of learning community will really get so worked up about the fact that, or their perception, and I think it's probably generally true, is that there's not a whole lot of cognitive science in a lot of these teacher prep programs. I think there's not a lot of other things as well. So I'm curious, like, how you felt in terms of their preparedness, and then what it was that you were focusing on with them as a sort of, I guess, post-grad or whatever that might be called.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating program, and really the vision behind it started in the early 90s was to take recent college graduates who had expertise in a particular area. So you might be a chemistry major, you might be a math major, you might be, in my case, I was a philosophy major during undergrad. So I wasn't being able to teach high school science, but they saw, philosophy perfect for third grade. You can answer some of those big questions that the kids might have, which they actually had a fair number of, which I loved. But the goal is basically to bring in people who are highly intelligent. It's a very competitive program. So I think, unlike many other teacher training programs, Notre Dame intentionally limits their cohort size pretty intentionally, and also creates, it's about half and half male and female as well. So they do a lot to recruit male teachers. And then because it is really selective and it is a fully funded program, you get a lot of high quality applicants. So I think the goal here was really to attract human capital to education, and then put them into summer school classrooms over the summer, train them up on teaching, get them into practical training right away with mentor teachers and folks who are experienced educators, in addition to taking, your typical kind of classroom classes that you need for certification, because you're earning your master's in education at the same time. And then during the school year, you go out to one of about 35 cities around the country, and you actually live with other teachers who are also placed in the city with you. So part of the commitment of the program, and I think this is kind of genius, is built-in support of other first-year teachers as well as second-year teachers in the program. So it's a 2-year commitment, and you kind of have this revolving of, you have a first-year cohort and a second-year cohort in the same house. Might be 6 teachers. Some of them might be at the same school, but often all different schools. But in my case, I had a second-year teacher who had taught 4th grade, who was able to, help me with my classroom as a 3rd grade teacher in a different school, who had been there, done that, and it was automatically built into the structure of the program. So thinking very comprehensively about the supports and surrounding you with community and people as you begin that first year of teaching, I think was, really a genius part of the program, in addition just to recruiting really high caliber folks from, places like Notre Dame and other universities around the country. So
maybe I misunderstood. So the I guess teachers in this program weren't like they didn't graduate with certified teaching.
That's right. Yeah.
So they
some of them, but very few of them. Yeah.
Okay. And were you one of them?
I was. Yeah. So I went to Notre Dame. I studied philosophy and Chinese. and thought I was going to go to law school, and fortunately dodged it. And ended up deciding to, go into to try teaching. And I had grown up going to Catholic schools. I really felt, a tie to this system, and wanted to kind of give back in a lot of ways. So I thought this is a really good way to use my talents. And so I ended up signing up, and that's kind of started my journey in education.
Gotcha. Well, I too thought I wanted to be an attorney and go to law school, and then interned with an attorney and went, oh, no. And ended up teaching as well. So you went to Catholic schools. What, I assume that was pretty traditional?
Yeah. And my school, so I grew up actually in Sacramento, California, and went to a Catholic school there growing up. Found my way to, the football capital for Catholics in the Midwest at Notre Dame. And so I've been really connected to Catholic education for a long time. And, I think if you've seen any of the statistics on Catholic schools across the country, they really were at their height in terms of student enrollment in the 50s. There was a huge number of kids, I think upwards of 5 million kids in Catholic schools around the country at that time. I think we're less than half of that now. Compared to the 1950s. So there's really been a big change and market decline in Catholic school enrollment. And interestingly, Florida, where I taught, is one of the few states where that trend is actually reversing. So that is a state in which not only private schools are growing, but the Catholic sector in terms of schooling is also growing. I think over the last 10 years, the Catholic enrollment in schools there is up around 10 to 15%. And I think a big part of that is, Florida has the country's largest private school choice program. So there's a lot that folks see in that. And I think those schools have really been able to provide opportunities, and families want them because they continue to grow and build new schools there. So I think that's been really positive.
Well, I won't hold the Notre Dame affiliation against you. As we were talking before we hit record, I grew up in the shadow of Notre Dame, just across the border there in Michigan. And as you may well be aware, when you live in that area, you either love them or hate them. And I was not in the love them camp.
Yeah, I get that.
But I won't hold that against you. Interesting that Catholic schools, here in Louisville, Kentucky, of course, Catholic schools are really big. And I think one of the reasons, I don't know if they're declining or not. They may be. You'll maybe know better than I do. I don't pay that close attention, but it's a big Catholic school system in Louisville. And one of the reasons, of course, is because, at least I think, perceived, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad perception, of the JCPS, the local public school system, which has some good schools and some real challenges, and every big city kind of has some of those things. And we have not had school choice until, I think, just now recently. I think officially now. Well, we've had school choice, but there's been some things that have made it difficult to exercise that school choice. So, a lot of families in Louisville, Kentucky have chosen Catholic schools, whether or not they want the religious aspect of it. They just, I think, see it as a better option. Arguably, who knows? But anyways, be that as it may, let's talk about your piece in Education Next, not Ed Week, school choice or school spending. Florida's 15-year experiment points to the answer. And this is building off, I guess you'd call it a paper or a study, or executive summary is the title that I'm looking at here, which is School Choice Competition versus New Education Spending, Estimating the Academic Benefits for Public School Students. And, I've looked at it, and some people have been talking about it on social media, but I guess give us the sort of elevator pitch. What's the sort of genesis of it, and kind of unpack the findings and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I got interested in this because, when we go out and talk about the benefits of private school choice for families, we're often talking in terms of the students who would be able to benefit from a scholarship. So it might be a smaller program. A lot of times the programs, especially the ones that we advocate for, are targeted or at least prioritized for low-income kids or for kids with disabilities around the country. And so, there are some cases where the school is not a good fit for them. They don't have the financial means to choose another option necessarily. So creating that a little benefit from the state to be able to make that jump possible, it's almost always pitched in those terms. And then what ends up happening on the other side in many of the states in which we are working is the public school folks will come in, and understandably they say, well, we also need resources. So, you shouldn't be spending this money on the school choice program. You should be putting this money into public schools. and public schools really need these resources. But I also knew that there was this rich research literature, and I think because of my background, both studying school choice programs here in Indiana, as well as some of my work on teachers, I knew about the school spending literature. So there's kind of like these two big research literatures. So one on school spending and one on the effects of competition. And the competition effect studies are looking at not how the kids who use the program are doing, but what happens to the kids in local public schools as these programs grow over time. And the most famous study of school competition is from the state of Florida. And, interestingly, and part of the reason why I really love working on this paper is that, my school and my kids are in these data that were part of this big study by Professor David Figlio, used to be at Northwestern, really eminent economist. All of these papers were published in top economics journals. And basically what he found is over the first 15 years of the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program, which was the initial private school choice program in Florida for very low income kids. That program grew from 15,000 kids to over 100,000 kids in 15 years. And for the public school kids in areas around where there were private schools, so basically you can think of like high competition areas, they split the state in half and said the half of schools in high competition areas, the half of schools in low competition areas. They found that those kids in those high competition areas after 15 years were 120 days ahead in terms of their reading, and their math test scores were also ahead by quite a bit over those after that 15 years as compared to those kids in the low competition areas. So they called this like a quasi-experimental study design. So they're trying to approximate an experimental condition where you have kind of a treatment of high competition and a control of low competition, and compare how these kids are doing. And so basically what I did with this research synthesis that I did was just kind of put these two literatures head to head and just say, hey, if you took that same amount of money that you spent on the scholarship program over these 15 years, and instead of spending it on scholarships, just put it into the public school system and use the best findings from the school spending literature that say, here's how much learning we would expect if you just added this money. I actually found that the effect for those public school kids in high competition areas was 11 times higher for the same cost through the competition route versus just the pure school spending amount. And I think a big part of that is really that spending money at scale is really hard to do well. It's a small effect for a fairly large cost. Whereas with the competition effect, and part of the, I think, interesting piece of it from an educational intervention standpoint is that as the program got bigger, the effects actually got larger, which is different than what you would normally see for any other educational intervention. So whether that's tutoring, class sizes, lots of other popular things that we say are really effective, a lot of those can be done really well on a small kind of local level, maybe a school or even a small district. But when you try to scale those up, it gets really difficult, really expensive, and hard to maintain the same impact. So I basically wanted to say, to folks, private school choice does not need to be a zero-sum game. It really can be something that can benefit both those families that are using it and the public schools. And I think Florida has kind of demonstrated in their way how it was, how a well-designed system can create those benefits. And now thinking about how might you be able to replicate that in other places.
Okay, so the pressure of the competition, according to what you found, was had a stronger positive effect than just the overall spending. And I think it's an interesting finding. And one of the things, I was actually talking with somebody who is running for office and was trying to pick my brain about school choice and all of the things that sort of surround that. And I, trying to be honest and blunt, you've got, as you point out, I think a lot of the spending that we see, especially it seems like in big districts, and maybe you'll know better than I, but there's a lot of waste, right? There's not a lot of bang for the buck. I think when I talk with Vladimir Kogan and his book, if you read that, there's some examples of fraud and waste, and other podcasts that I've done as well. Are there schools? Did you find schools, public schools, that were and use this as part of the findings that did really I guess maybe were more effective with their spending, did get more bang for their buck. And is that a model that should be included in this sort of competition, or weighted a little bit more than just sort of generally across the board, the mean?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, interestingly, they actually found, that 120-day impact on growth. So that's about 2/3 of a school year, if you think about that over those 15 years. They actually found that the effect was larger for low-income students, which I think was really interesting. They found 140 days for low-income students, which were the group that were targeted by the scholarship at the time. So they were the only ones that were eligible. And David Figlio and his team, in the early years of the program, actually went out and did a statewide survey, several statewide surveys of principals in separate studies, basically looking at this set of reforms in Florida. So it included private school choice, but also included a number of accountability reforms. So if you remember from kind of the early mid-2000s, Florida was kind of at the front of putting in place a number of things like kind of these third grade retention laws for reading. So you have to be on grade level or be able to pass after a couple tries these reading exams. They piloted some of these school grade different evaluation systems where schools would have a public signal to say they're not serving their kids well or not. And I think paired with a private school choice program where a number of families, it wasn't a huge number, right? Because at the time it was maybe 50,000 kids that had access to this tiny percentage of the Florida public school system. But principals would know that if they weren't performing, that families actually had another option. They just didn't have a captive audience there. So there wasn't this flight from public schools, but public schools would lose a few kids. And when they went out and talked to principals, a lot of them actually talked about needing to reallocate resources within their schools to target interventions for some of their lowest performers, both to hit the accountability goals, but also because they knew of the voucher, in their mind, the voucher threat of a parent could take their kid and leave, and so I'm losing the state revenue that kid otherwise would be providing to my school. So there's an incentive to improve there. So there's kind of a whole host of things that he talks about in that study that's a little bit more qualitative. That's super fascinating. And I think it really speaks to some of the dynamism that they built, where you have a bit of a check on the public school system that might otherwise allocate money for adults. And I think this is part of Professor Kogan's point, is you can end up in a situation where you have a lot of lobbyists and folks representing the interests of teachers, which in many ways I think is good. I want teachers to be treated well, and I want teachers to be well paid, but it can sometimes happen at the expense of students. And so who is there lobbying for the students and their interests? Who is there making sure that resources are also being given to the classroom level instead of the district or other program consultant level that are not going to be as effective or helpful for students versus some of these adult interests? So I think it actually redirected what Florida was able to do.
So the idea is the sort of mechanism and lever is that the pressure and competition from outside schools in essentially competing for customers is one way to say it. I don't particularly like that, because I think,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, school choice, sometimes some of those arguments get, like it's like a restaurant, right? And you have a competitive restaurant and one has to get better, and those aren't, schools and restaurants are not the same thing for a number of reasons. So I find that to be a little troubling. But anyways, competing for students, competing for families, competing for whatever that might be, and then ostensibly money. I wonder, did that change, or how did that change with the presence of the density of the number of private school options, choice options, and any new ones, right? So was it just the fact that there were other options, or newer options developing as funding became available? Did that have much of an effect? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so this is, there's a piece that the study looked at. So that kind of competitive pressure index, if you will, the way that you put it was, where are these areas, these pockets of higher competition where you have a number of factors that are influencing the options that kids have access to. And so in order to help fix this comparison in the study, they actually used the footprint, if you will, of private schools surrounding a public school. So those options within a certain drive distance. They also looked at religious communities that are within a certain distance of public schools, because most private schools do have a religious association, not all of them, but a majority. And so kind of created this competitive pressure index and used that to kind of split the high competition and low competition areas. They kept that competition index fixed in terms of their comparison over the 15 years to be pre-intervention in terms of the kickoff of the scholarship program. But we do know that many of those high competition areas they tended to be more urban, more densely populated. They did have more schools open. And that is a feature of the Florida program. If you look at the number of private schools that are open in Florida and track their growth over time, there are hundreds of private schools that didn't exist even 10 years ago within Florida. So we do know that the building of additional schools is likely part of this story. It wasn't something that they looked at specifically, but those high competition areas created the possibility for that. So it was not just the existing private school blueprint, but also knowing that families had the option to go out and start your own school. And I think that's a lot of thoughts teachers and families have sometimes. If a teacher is not doing well in their school and they get together with a couple friends that are also teachers and say, hey, what would it look like if we started our own school? What kind of mechanisms are available for us to do that? And interestingly, today, Florida now has a whole, I don't know how much you've talked about this on the podcast before, but they have a whole suite of different micro school options there in Florida, which are really interesting. These are kind of small school experiments. They might have anywhere from 20 to 50 kids, often run by former public school teachers who wanted to start something very specific, often for a very targeted population. And I think it's interesting politically as well, because you have a lot of maybe more conservative traditional homeschool families who will opt into this kind of option. Will say, we're going to start a classical micro school. But then you also have a lot of very progressive educators who look at the traditional public school system and say, there's just so many restraints, restrictions, scheduling on our kids. We really want to create our own vision of what education looks like. And we can do that, especially in a space for kids who might be more psychologically vulnerable, maybe experience bullying, folks who have been in the hospital for another reason or another, these young kids, and to provide a different school option. Even though they're very progressive politically, they love the option to be able to start their own small schools. So I do think that's actually a part of the story.
Yeah. So the reason, in your estimation, that the public schools were improving is because I feel like I'm repeating the question, but like the idea of competition.
Yeah.
But are there more details to that, more specifics? I mean, I'm not formulating a question very gracefully here, but like schools, like I said, restaurants and schools are different, right? You see customers going there, but not here. And schools are different, right? There's a number of purposes that they serve. There's different constraints on them. My mom was a principal. She tried to get me to be a principal, and I said, you got to be crazy, because people think that a principal has all this autonomy to just, make this happen, make that happen, but they don't. And schools just in general are not particularly agile, right? And I'm curious too, because it seems to me in my work with principals and school leaders, they don't often, and maybe that's just a feature of our work, but they don't tend to talk about, well, we've got to get better because that they're taking our kids, right? They tend to sort of be focused on things that are day to day and learning and that kind of thing, and sort of let the chips fall where they may. But you're thinking that they're a bit more, I guess, engaged with that process.
Yeah, I mean, this is an insightful question. It's actually one that the researchers in this study pressed on a lot, because they really wanted to uncover these mechanisms for why competition is working the way it was. Some of it which they could answer with their data, a lot of it they could not. And I actually think there's some interesting evidence from other states that can help us understand this. So I think first, so in my state of Indiana, there have been a number of studies on the voucher program here. And one thing that they found for kids who switched as a result of this voucher policy in Indiana was that public school students who moved into private school were actually more likely to have a history of disciplinary incidents within their public school, which is a little bit contrary to most people expect. They often believe, the ones that are switching are going to be the more advantaged, the ones that are easier to teach. But actually what they found when it was, and particularly when it's a low income targeted program, that it was the families that were struggling in the public school system. So it was the families who felt like the public school wasn't a good fit. Perhaps the disciplinary system or the kid's behavior and that mix of peers was not working well. And so when they had an option, they moved that kid. That was actually beneficial for the public school because they had fewer disciplinary incidents happening within their school, and also a better fit for that kid because then they're seeking out an environment that is a better match for that child. So I think some of what school choice enables is a little bit of this matching effect, both for students and for teachers. Teachers traditionally have a little bit better time doing this. They can sort into the school that is a good fit for them pedagogically. In states without school choice, you have to live next to the school that is the good fit for you, unless there's a choice program. So I think part of what was happening is a little bit this match effect. And interestingly, Figlio in the study found that as a result of this school choice expansion, disciplinary incidents within public schools actually went down, as well as the number of absences for public school students as well. So this is kind of a secondary finding in that same paper. And I think some of that was actually this movement of kids out of public schools who may have been struggling in that way. And a couple other things too. I mean, anytime you have a couple kids switch, and they tested this in the paper, you have a small class size reduction. So the class size reductions were not huge, but on average, I think by the end of the 15 years, the average class in these high competition areas decreased by like 3/4 of a student on average, right, across these high competition schools. So pretty small reduction, but you can actually see the impact of that on average that's a little test score bump that comes with better teacher-student ratios in public schools. So I think some of the test score effect is due to that as well. Yeah, and then I think finally, I mean, kind of going back to the matching piece, obviously school discipline is there, but also just other peer effects. So when you have kids placed into schools and families aren't the ones driving that decision, you're going to have less alignment, not only with the school's set of policies, procedures, but also with peers within your school. So I know, for example, a lot of the families that came to our school in Florida were there because that was their faith community. So on Sundays, they would be in mass, and some of the families could afford to send their kids to our school. Some of them could not. We had a very vibrant Spanish mass community, lots of immigrants in Florida from Spanish-speaking countries around Latin America and the Caribbean. A lot of those families would be in mass on Sunday, and it was only as a result of the scholarship program that many of them were able to send their kids to our school. And that was a kind of value alignment in terms of family culture and the school culture. And I think that that's something that, some states that don't have these programs kind of miss out on, right? Those families don't have that same kind of value alignment when it comes to kind of reasons for learning, the way that you prioritize the virtues and other things that you want to teach your kids in terms of character within the school. So I think all those are beneficial for the kids that use it. And then, the kids who are still in the public school, arguably a lot of them, it's a better fit on average because of that.
So are there any things that you took into account? Because I can imagine some of the things that you're citing and saying, learning increases and things that were advantages and good effects for the public schools that might be maybe temporary, but then not those might go away because less resources and money and those kinds of things. You get through the end of the school year and maybe you have fewer students but the same amount of money, but then the next year you have less money and maybe more students, or maybe the same, maybe less. So I'm curious. I know there was like sort of this 15-year window, but I'm wondering how you might have accounted for any of those sort of ups and downs that might be a little more temporary.
Yes, I think the challenge with a study like this is you are looking at an average effect over a fairly long period of time. And I think the reason why I did this comparison was to help people realize how small the school spending effect is. I mean, if you look over these 15 years of the competition effect, if you put it for education researchers or wonks listening, so that 120-day effect is the same as about 0.166 standard deviations. So that moves you about, it's about 5-6 percentile points in terms of like moving you from the 50th percentile to the 55th or 56th. And that effect is kind of considered moderate within the education research literature over the course of 15 years. So it's not, the competition effect isn't some, crazy unheard of effect within education research. And it happened over a very long period of time. So I think in many ways, the competition effect is quite modest. I think meaningful, but modest. But I wanted to point out is how cost effective it was. It was a modest effect for a very low cost to the state. And I think in contrast, there's been a number of studies published in the last couple of years. The most famous of them is this meta-analysis, which is where they took 31 of the highest quality school spending studies, put them all together. It's a study by Jackson, who's also a Northwestern professor, was part of the Biden administration's Council of Economic Advisors, very famous economist. He published the study, really groundbreaking, that says, yes, school spending matters and it creates a positive impact on student learning. But I think the challenge is what they found was you had to spend $1,000 per pupil per year. And the resulting gain from that was only about 5 extra days of learning for every $1,000 extra dollars you spend in 2018 dollars. So it's a noticeable effect. It would be a very small effect in terms of the education literature for that extra $1,000. But if you try to bring that to any amount of meaningful scale, you are spending a tremendous amount of money and just getting relatively modest returns. And I think we actually saw that over the pandemic with the ESSER experiment. I don't know how familiar you are with all of the money kind of given out through ESSER. Yes. Yes, right. Yes. So, I mean, we spent $190 billion. It was the largest one-time federal investment in education ever. And to put that in context, that's about 1/5 of what we spend on education across the United States at every level every year. We're spending close to $1 trillion a year on education now. But we basically did, for that 1 year, we had that $190 billion boost for over the course of 2 to 3 years over the pandemic. There was 2 really high quality evaluations of that money that were done. And basically look at this same school spending question. And one of the researchers from one of those studies, both studies found effects very much in line with the meta-analysis, which was very interesting. It was almost exactly the same, if not a little bit less effective. One of the studies found no effect on reading scores as a result of all of that extra money for districts that receive more money versus those that receive less. But they said if you just use the school spending approach to get student achievement back to 2019 levels, so just before pandemic, get back to baseline in terms of where kids are scoring, you would have to spend an additional $450 to $650 billion. So on top of the $190 billion that we had already spent. So theoretically, you could get there using the school spending approach, but it is an unbelievable amount of money that we simply do not have, would be unwilling from a political level or even a popular level to allocate to education. And so the question is really, well, if the school spending approach can't take you there, what are the set of educational interventions that are more cost effective that we know do work and can reach scale? All of those things are very hard. And I actually am arguing basically that competitive effects are one of those options that school leaders and system leaders and policymakers should be considering, because it does hit that threshold of very cost effective on a per pupil expenditure level, but actually produces a quite moderate effect at the scale of more than half the state, right? So by that end of the 15 years, it was affecting over 1.5 million kids in Florida who were in those high competition areas. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that was a conservative estimate, because I'm not even counting all of the partial competition that you're getting in those kids who just missed that high competition cutoff on the other side. We know that they were also being affected by competition, just not as much as the high competition areas, but that isn't even being taken into account in my analysis, and in addition to a couple other things. So, I think interestingly, it just far outpaces on the cost effectiveness front. I think folks just haven't really looked at these two things together before.
So that brings up a sort of a two-pronged question that comes to mind. One, which is about the ESSER funding, and yes, I'm very familiar with it. And from a professional learning perspective and provider, COVID just really, we took a big hit, and then all of a sudden there was all this money flowing, and of course, last September that money ended, and lots of school districts had spent it and allocated it as though it were never going to go away, and pulled back and hit the panic button, and some work that we were doing just evaporated because they said, well, we're not sure if we're going to be able to buy pencils, which brings up other questions about financial management and decision making, which is, a problem of all organizations, public schools, maybe more so, arguably, but maybe not. I don't know. But anyways, with this ESSER funding, so there was all this money, a lot of it spent on things like masks and ventilation and equipment, and some of it silliness of cleaning and stuff that eventually I think we realized wasn't necessary and what have you, but maybe made people feel better, whatever, and not so much on instructional time. So I guess part of my question is how fair is it to use that ESSER money as a sort of gauge and tie it to instructional time? But maybe sort of the flip side of that is if we talk about the competition effect and basically the metric is, if I'm understanding correctly, is learning gains, right? That we're seeing learning gains due to this competition effect. Not that learning gains are not important. Of course they are. But one thing that public schools maybe shouldn't be doing, but certainly do, is they serve other purposes, right? And that's a complaint that people say, well, they should be in the business of teaching and learning and not, this, that, and the other thing. But they are. I mean, they're public sort of institutions and part of the communities and serve some really important pieces. And so if we are only looking at learning gains, is that maybe too narrow in terms of what the effects might be on public schools and that competition effect? So yes, that piece. And then, if we're looking at ESSER funding that may not have been, always spent, and I don't know what the percentage is, maybe, how much of it was spent on, academic instructional kinds of things versus safety and that kind of thing. Is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I'll take the ESSER one first. So that is a very insightful question, because what I found striking, and I actually think about it from the other direction. So only 20% of the ESSER funds were specifically earmarked for academic instruction intervention. So you could use up to 80% for a lot of those other pieces. And some school districts use that money really well. To your point, some used it very poorly. A lot of them took on big construction projects like building a field, building a new track, going out and doing repairs, kind of, neglected projects that needed to be done. Some of that can have a return for students. And actually, one of the most cost-effective interventions that we have seen is actually improving ventilation. There's been a lot of really interesting papers come out in the last 5 to 10 years about the impact of pollution on kids within schools, as well as the impact of overly hot classrooms. So if you think about schools without air conditioning, that's actually very detrimental to student learning, because it's very hard to focus when it's really hot. And it's getting hotter in some places. And so because of that, those are actually very cost-effective interventions. And I think that was actually good uses of the ESSER money when they kind of went after the ventilation and the air systems. But a lot of them, and actually this is a large number of districts, really went out and, to your point, just hired a bunch of staff. And that is probably one of the worst things you could have done with the money, because now you've created continuing financial obligations for one-time money. And so what districts have had to do in the last year is make a lot of really painful cuts. And so it makes the money issue way worse than it would have been if they had perhaps invested that more strategically, or, done more of these short-term interventions for recovering from learning. But I think, what I took away from the ESSER experiments in terms of the evaluations on student learning was that it was striking how similar the learning gains were per $1,000, given it was only 20% required for academic instruction, and yet the point estimates, those impact results, were almost exactly in line with the meta-analysis of these studies where all of the money is supposed to be going to school spending. Or to, for academic instruction. And, the thing is, when they do these school spending studies, a lot of times they're looking at, for example, a local district who has a bond come up and people vote on it. And they compare these districts that just barely passed the bond to districts that barely didn't pass the bond. So you almost have, they're right on the other side of this cutoff point, and say those districts that got this extra tranche of money versus those that barely missed the bond, how are kids doing in those two districts compared to each other? And to me, it was a little dispiriting in a way that, the results of those districts getting that extra tranche of money was very much in line with these ESSER results, in which only 20% of the money is going to academic instruction. So it makes me think, what is happening when you pass a bond? Is only 20% of that money going to academic instruction as well? Or how does this translate kind of between contexts? Because I think you are right. In a general sense, I would not hold up ESSER as a pure evaluation of school spending at all, which is really why I lean on the meta-analysis for my study, because I think that is the most credibly causal and up-to-date that look at the effect of school spending. But to me, it was just kind of striking that lined up so well.
Yeah. So then the other part of that question of while perhaps, and you're claiming that there's some learning gains and competition effect for the public schools, are there negative effects that might be important to consider that are not necessarily tied specifically to learning, that public schools, sort of function as part of a community that private schools, I suppose, could, but I don't think people see them as doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm totally on board. I'm on your team on this, because I think that we need to have a much broader conversation about the outcomes of education that obviously go beyond reading and math scores. I think a lot of times people will talk about school quality in terms of, how high can your school's test scores be? And I think in a lot of ways, that's not how I would recommend looking at it, even though I study test scores for a living. I think, back to your restaurant analogy, for example, here, I don't want a health inspector to come by your restaurant and say, this is the best restaurant in the city. Everybody should go to a restaurant like this. No other restaurants are as good as this restaurant. It's almost like this Yelp review idea of like, we've rated the highest quality restaurant in town. But what I do want a health inspector who comes and says, I want to make sure there are no rats in the soup in the back of the shop, right? I want to make sure that folks are cleaning all of the cooking utensils when they're done, that there isn't just expired meat sitting out on a shelf outside of a refrigerator. And I think when we talk about school quality, to me, it's about, are schools able to hit that minimum kind of baseline in terms of what we expect teaching kids to read, these basic math skills that are needed for success in the world, and then allowing all of these other outcomes to be a part of what we expect from education. And part of the reason why I'm enthusiastic about private school choice is that it does encourage that kind of pluralism on school quality on the top end. So thinking about, once you've hit that minimum, what are the different directions? What are the different ways I want our kids to grow? And that might be different depending on the community you're living in. If you're in a rural area, much more of a city, perhaps the kinds of careers you're aspiring to by the time you're in high school. There's lots of really interesting magnet programs for folks who want to be like machinists or pilots or those kinds of things once you get to high school, that they say like, yeah, I want to go to pursue this and I want to get a job right after I graduate. And I think you can do that within a more school choice centric system and are a lot more constrained in the current way our public schools are run, which is, I think a lot of them, and I would love to see them be able to do more of that. I think they are, which is good. But having a system where you have these options kind of encourages that dynamism. And, I think there are potentially negative effects on the public schools on these other dimensions. I think we need more work on that. We don't have a lot of research on what some of those downsides might be. I think anecdotally, what you will hear is that programs are getting cut in rural areas, for example, at high schools or elementary schools. And so the association a lot of people make is, well, let's take Arizona, for example. Lots of rural areas in Arizona, they have a large school choice program. There's a rural school who is struggling to pass a bond to increase their revenue. And what they see is their population is dwindling in this rural area. And as a result, they have to cut the arts program at their school. And I think the open question is, oftentimes they're in Arizona, they have an education savings account, this type of school choice scholarship account. That often gets the blame for why the arts program gets cut, when in fact, what is happening in many school systems and around the country right now is just massive enrollment decline in public schools. And that is driving a lot of the revenue loss for these public districts. And so I do think that's a challenge. And there are some states, I would say, that are arguably underspending on public schools, particularly in rural areas. And the challenge is, you can have that average spending number at the state level, but underneath that, there's a lot of variation. There are some districts that are getting a lot of money and some districts that are getting very little, even within the same state. And I think that is a big challenge for a number of states that are still kind of fighting this state versus local funding problem, where the really local centric districts, if they don't pass a bond, they're starving. But if they pass a bond, it's like they've got all this money and now they got to, figure out how to use it effectively. I don't think that that's necessarily a good model, and some places have really struggled as a result of that.
Yeah, it strikes me as a very colorable argument, and maybe more so in rural areas, that while you could really, have some great things that might come from additional school choice and options for students to go to school, a small town, especially if it's quite rural, you can imagine, or at least I can imagine a good argument to be made for the sort of cultural anchor that a public school might serve, and the choice, activating maybe some sort of atomization of that, which, I think, again, what it's a trade-off, right? There's opportunity costs here, increased opportunities for education. Are there negative effects on the community that might, we might see play out in, a number of ways? That could be crime, could be related to education, could be a number of things, right? I would think that maybe is a bit more pronounced in rural areas, but maybe not. And there's not really a question there. It just was an observation that I think is something that the school choice movement, sometimes that kind of gets left out of the conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And actually, okay, I want to push back on that a little bit, because I think there's some really interesting, both evidence as well as just stories of the role that private schools often play, particularly in urban areas, as a part of the community. So even just looking over the history of the Catholic school movement in the United States, which I'm most familiar with, the reason why we have so many Catholic schools in the United States is because there were so many Catholic immigrants at the time. So if you go back to the early 1900s, late 1800s, that you had waves of German, Irish, Italian, all kinds of Catholic immigrants come to the United States who were seen as, at the time, kind of second-class citizens. They were, at the time, every public school was a religious school. They read the Bible in school at the time, but it was the King James Bible. They were not allowed to read the Catholic Bible. And so the Catholics were not about this. They didn't want to be forced into kind of the American Protestant version of education. And so they ended up starting their own schools as a result of this. And that really helped to integrate and Americanize Catholic immigrants at the time, who were seen as kind of this foreign group of folks that we didn't want here in the United States. You can think about the Irish and the Italians on the East Coast. And I think, interestingly, here in South Bend, where I live, we still have all of those Catholic schools. But now most of them are not populated by European immigrants. Many of them are actually populated by Hispanic immigrants from across Mexico and Latin America, which is really interesting. So, there's a school in town here that, when it was built, was Polish. So, they had Mass in Polish. This was a community institution, right, for that community here in South Bend. But now it's 95% Hispanic, and almost all of them receive the Indiana voucher. And for them, coming to the United States, this is a huge source of community and really is a community institution within a small to mid-sized town, and plays an important role in bringing them into the American project, right? So for folks who feel perhaps unsafe or feel as though there aren't institutions that they can connect to naturally, where they don't have their language spoken at school, or don't see things like, if you've seen pictures of Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? This is a very famous image of Jesus's mother Mary that might be up on the wall, right? That's very tied into a cultural expression of Catholicism. You'll see those things in these schools that you wouldn't see in a public school. And so they are very much part of the community and very much part of, these families. And I think philosophically, at a broader point, I think what school choice enables is for civil society to be engaged in the project of education. So does it just need to be a government provider of education? Or can you also say, we should bring in nonprofits, we should bring in these institutions, these voluntary associations that people throughout American history have formed, and allow that to also be a vehicle for educating kids. And I think religious communities do that. I think there are many other examples, right? You could think of Montessori schools and that movement. They come in and say, here's our vision for education. We want to start schools that are non-religious, but still kind of embrace this educational philosophy. So I think that is the broader philosophical point, that it actually is a part of community and part of civil society, and actually benefits these basically civil outcomes for kids, that they get involved in their community and get involved in government because of their participation in these groups.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I think that's largely true. I guess when I'm thinking of, like, I've done some work in like Eastern Kentucky schools, and if you've ever been in Eastern Kentucky, there's not a whole lot going on. And the public schools tend to be a sort of anchor for those communities in a way. And I'm not advocating against school choice in that. I just think it's an interesting, like an important thing to take into account that I don't know that gets taken into account in some of those places. South Bend is, that's not a rural place. It's a mid-sized city, low to mid-sized city. But you go to Owsley County in Kentucky, and schools are one of the, if not the largest employer, and the physical buildings are a sort of root and anchor. And you could argue that maybe the schools are doing too much, and that could be replicated in other ways. I'm not against that necessarily, but just learning gains being the metric, and that's you're not saying that should be the only metric, but that can be, I think, a little bit of a I don't know, fool's gold or something like that. So something.
No, it's a very good point. And actually, I mean, this is actually something I would like to study more. I've thought about this a fair bit. Because, I think on the one hand, if you have a traditional voucher program where you can only use that scholarship at a brick and mortar private school, there aren't private schools in rural areas. Mm-hmm. So because of that, there are no other options for those families to go to. And so theoretically, there should be no impact to those rural public schools, because you're not losing any students to private school choice. Mm-hmm. So I think that on the one hand, you have that. There are some programs that are designed, like Florida's now, where you can start a micro school, or you can use it for home education. So there you could theoretically say, well, there could be these kids who would be in the public school who could now homeschool using this money, mm-hmm. or form their own micro school. And I do think, interestingly, what has actually happened in a number of pockets of Florida is that families who would have homeschooled anyway, which is a lot more common in rural areas, now use a portion of their education account, because they receive an account with about $8,000 in it, which is about half of what public school kids in Florida receive all in. They can actually go to the public school and basically purchase services. So they can go and say, I want to sign up for band. I want to go play sports. I want to go take a physics class, because it's going to be hard for me to learn physics at home. So I'm going to go take a physics class. And now a majority of public school districts in Florida have opted in to be basically eligible for this marketplace that they've created for participation. So I think it's a lot more mixed than people perhaps think at first blush, just because there are opportunities for public schools to also bring in resources that they otherwise wouldn't have had through these types of arrangements. So, mm-hmm. I obviously would not want these community institutions to go away in rural areas. And I think that the evidence shows that they really haven't, as a result of private school choice. And if anything, a lot of these areas are losing a tremendous amount of enrollment because of deindustrialization, the way that jobs have shifted, and that encourages people to leave these rural areas. But if you have a good educational option, if you don't like your public school and can use something like an ESSER or start a micro school, that actually preserves population potentially in these rural areas for families who would otherwise say, like, I don't have a good option for my kid to go to school. We're going to leave. Like, we're just going to go to the city. We're going to go to somewhere a little more populated, and you continue to lose enrollment versus being able to maybe start a school with 20 kids. Mm-hmm. That will have a small impact on the public schools, but you still have that tax base of that person living there. So yeah, I would like to do more research on this, because I think the picture is much more complicated
mm-hmm.
than we sometimes hear.
So you mentioned minimum quality or some language like that. And that actually brings up one of the things that I tend to really wonder about and have a critique of the school choice movement writ large. And again, I'm an advocate of school choice, but I don't see or haven't seen any sort of mechanism in place that does sort of ensure that minimum quality, right? And that's one of my concerns, is that just having choices, if they're not better choices and aren't academically minimum quality choices, then that's not good. And then of course there's other things. They might teach things that are untrue, or they might be a number of things that aren't consistent with what our communities and our sort of democracy needs. So that I think is a question. I'm curious, and it maybe extends outside of the pieces, the study and the executive summary and stuff like that. But I'm curious to hear any thoughts you have on that kind of thing. And specifically, like, if we're going to expect some minimum teacher quality, or not teacher quality, but learning quality, but teacher quality, or some versions of that, some minimum academic quality, let's say, who should and how should that be, I guess, instilled? Because I am, sort of sympathetic to like Neil McCluskey. He says federal government has no role in this, and so is it the states? I mean, he's actually, I think, complained about the federal tax scholarship here in Kentucky, which is the new legislation, and wondering, I think he thinks it's unconstitutional because it is federal money there. But is it something that the federal government might be in charge of in terms of leadership, or is that left to states, or how do we get that minimum academic quality?
Yeah, so there's a lot of challenges, and I think hopefully also opportunities in this area. So I feel lucky, especially as a researcher, to work for AFC, because our model programs do contain a requirement for a nationally norm reference test to be a part of the legislation for school choice programs. So what that means is, you might be familiar with things like the Iowa Basics. That's a very common nationally norm reference test that kids took forever before we had our kind of state standardized tests as required by No Child Left Behind. So kind of pre that, there's tons of people taking Iowa Basics. There's still a lot of public and private schools taking that. You might have heard of NWEA MAP tests, Renaissance Star. So like there's a whole suite of very well-known, well-respected nationally norm reference tests that actually give schools options in terms of how they assess student learning every year. So places like Florida do have a assessment requirement. So the kids there have to take the state test, or they can choose one of those nationally norm reference tests. And those get reported every year to the university, Florida State University. And so they do accumulate those. I would love to see us continue to improve these systems. I think the choice programs are not there yet in terms of getting good transparency, both for parents and for the public, to kind of see how schools and kids are performing. To me, the most important constituency here is parents. So are parents getting good information on how their kids are growing academically year to year? And there are a handful of programs around the country where parents really don't have access to that data. So they might be seeing some of those other outcomes that you're speaking to, that they say, wow, I'm really happy they're growing in these areas, and that they're getting this kind of experience and time. But at a fundamental level, and especially when you have larger programs that are being funded with taxpayer dollars, I think it's very reasonable to assume that there is the basics being taught as well. And so, David Figley has actually talked about this before, and I think it's a very good way of expressing it, is if you kind of think about kind of a distribution of school quality, right? So you kind of have, your bell curve from stats class, if you've ever taken a statistics class, right? Most of your schools are going to be clustered in that middle area, right? The 80+% of schools are going to be somewhere within, that middle average, that have far surpassed kind of like your bottom tier schools. And I think, the opportunity and concern with some private school choice programs that don't give especially good information to parents is that what it unlocks is some of these private schools at the very top end of the distribution. So some of your best schools, best experiments in the state that are going really well, that kids didn't have access to before because they didn't have the scholarship or funding to get there. But it also opens up a possibility for bad actors or people who are just not doing education. It's just they're literally just a daycare for young kids on that low end. And I think the problem is, right, we have that across all sectors. We have that in public schools. We have that in charter schools. Those lowest quality schools are a challenge everywhere. It doesn't matter what school sector you're in. So, I think the private school choice movement is confronting this at the same time that public schools are also backing away from accountability and backing away from testing any kind of measure of these basic competencies. And I think we really need to push back against that and say, we really do need to be identifying these lowest performing schools and at least be signaling to parents, hey, you really need to be on top of this, because if you're sending your kids here, there's a real risk to their future. And providing good information on what are at least above bar options, which is the vast majority of schools, but obviously a huge challenge. So, I mean, where I work and what we advocate for and what I would love to see is good data on this. But I think there isn't one right way to measure it. There's a number of well-respected, good ways of doing it. I think the challenge is a lot of states will want to force private school choice programs into only taking the state test. And I think that can be problematic because it really forces all private schools to look a lot like public schools in terms of their scope and sequence, their curriculum, aligning to state standards, which might not fit exactly the way that the private school would want to organize their school year or even grade system, right? Like moving third to fourth to fifth grade, et cetera.
Yeah. And the academic quality is not unique to school choice. It's regardless of school choice. I think it's still a problem is kind of what you're noting there. Maybe one last question. And again, this is, I think, a little bit outside the bounds of the paper and the article, but everything's polarized, right? Everybody's us versus them and binaries and stuff like that. School choice is obviously very polarized. And both ends of the spectrum, or both sides of the argument, have their villains, and they're not doing any favors for themselves. Teachers Union, Randy Weingarten, and all this stuff, right? Like, in some ways, that's a real liability for public schools and decisions and rhetoric and things that they've put on offer, let's say. But on the other side, you've got sort of the villain of the Betsy DeVos and that kind of movement, which can maybe unfairly, but I think there's some things that may be fair of like they're really coming after public schools, and there's a lot of faith organization there that people who aren't wanting public money to be involved with religious, especially, I guess, aggressively religious, maybe is a way to talk about this. So how does the school choice movement, and I don't expect you to have the answer to this because this is a really hard problem, but how does the school choice movement navigate that in a way that is productive, but also recognizes and realizes and talks about those realities in a way that is, I get called a both sides, but this is a both sides kind of problem in my estimation. It's not equal, it's not equivocating, but there are issues on both sides. And so how do we move forward productively and sort of reckon with those realities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, I actually give, to reference one name you mentioned there, but Secretary DeVos, I think, has actually done more for the school choice movement, and I think actually to the future of this question than almost anyone else, because of this new education freedom tax credit at the federal level. So, this was a new federal tax credit that was passed as part of the reconciliation bill last summer, the tax and budget bill. And, what it enables is for families to give donations to scholarship organizations, and they can receive up to $1,700 dollar for dollar credit off of their federal taxes for that voluntary contribution to a scholarship organization. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that, that idea has been in development for over a decade, largely because of Betsy DeVos and her interest in bringing school choice to states that didn't have it before. But I also think part of the brilliance of that idea and how it has become instantiated in policy is that those scholarship organizations can give scholarships to private school kids, but also to public school kids, charter school kids, and in some states, homeschool kids as well. And so I actually believe, and for states like Kentucky, once we get, far enough down the road on implementing this, there will be, a handful of families in Kentucky that will be able to benefit from this as a scholarship for private school tuition. But there will be many more families, and I think most of the money will actually be flowing to public school families in the form of things like tutoring, special education services, transportation. These are all eligible expenses under the law for public school families. So I think that is actually a huge benefit in terms of thinking about how do we expand educational opportunity and driving resources directly to parents for them to use for their kids, regardless of the type of school you go to. It doesn't matter if it's a private school, charter, public, you have access to this money. And I think part of the challenge with the polarized environment is that we have not seen people be able to step outside of their lane in terms of the politics of this, right? So you have a lot of Democrats who are interested in school choice or would be interested in some form of private school choice. And they recognize that particularly among Black and Hispanic families that are a big part of their base, it has overwhelming majority support among those families for these programs. But they step out of line and vote for it. They get primaried, right? The political money comes after them. And so there's no room for them to move on this. And I think on the flip side for the Republicans, like a lot of them are scared to death that if you give an inch in terms of regulation, the other side will come and just turn your private school into a public school, that you have to do exactly everything they do in the public school system and not provide any meaningful choices. And I think that is the tension right now, that in some ways this new federal tax credit allows you to bystep in a way, right? You're able to drive resources to parents who then can utilize it. And the decisions aren't then being made by more politically constrained state legislators. It's being made by parents. And, the teachers unions really don't like this because I think in a lot of ways they want to be in charge of that money flow, which is why they want it moving through official state and federal budgets and not through a tax credit mechanism. Because here it's really scholarship organizations run by civil society, run by these nonprofits, and directed to parents and their kids. So I think it'll be a really interesting new experiment on what's possible. But I mean, we're talking billions of dollars that could be going for all of these educational services that wasn't previously available, which, really flies in the face of a lot of folks were worried that the Trump administration would be cutting funding for education. I think not only have they maintained the level of funding for things like special education, the title funding, they've just kept budgets the same. But this new federal tax credit actually unlocks all of this charitable giving that will be in addition to those existing dollars. So it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out. I think there's a lot of promise for places like Kentucky that doesn't have a state level private school choice program, but now has some opportunity through this.
Yeah, it'll be, and I do want to wrap this up here, but it will be interesting, and I do have some concerns about that money, that federal element of it, and the sort of constitutionality of it. But that's a different issue. A follow-up question to that, and I agree with a lot of what you said. Sort of that polarization and the left and the right. I'm wondering if you're seeing, or have seen, or anticipate seeing pressures from the right that might be politically and sort of culture war oriented. And I ask this in a way, so we do professional work, professional development, and last summer, I'm trying to remember exactly, sometime within the last year, since the Trump reelection, federal funding was frozen, right? And we were scheduled to do some work with a school in Kentucky that was getting money. It was a private school, a very Christian school. Certainly not. Well, let me preface it by saying that ostensibly the money was being frozen to be inspected for sort of radical left-wing ideology, right? This typical Trump rhetoric. And, I think there's some real problems, and I can point to some of those, but it's not everywhere. And certainly one wouldn't suspect it at this very conservative Christian school, right? Eventually the money got released and we did the work and we got paid and that kind of thing. But the principal was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. So it begs the question, as I'm thinking about any of this kind of thing, do you have concerns? Have you heard concerns? Do you anticipate concerns about these kinds of monies being subject to pressure from that sort of political ideology, culture war kind of mindset?
My understanding is part of the reason why they pursued the tax credit approach rather than a federal program, right? Because this is being run out of Treasury, and it's in the same way that you can get a tax credit for, a child dependent or other educational tax credits for higher education expenses. This is basically a supercharged donation tax credit, right? Right now you can get the deduction, but this is a $1-to-1 dollar credit for this. And part of that is to basically keep it out of these lanes of traditional federal regulation, right? You're normally going to be wary of these federal dollars that come with a lot of restrictions and regulations on them. But given the tax credit design, the folks that are most in charge here are the scholarship organizations. So these are the ones that are the recipients of donor money, and they are the ones making decisions about who the scholarships to. And so I like to think about it as more of a bottom-up accountability in terms of where donors are directing their money, and that scholarship organizations are going to have to demonstrate that they are serving the kids who need it the most, where families want to donate that money to in order to provide opportunity for kids in the community. And I think there will be states, there will be groups that will try to regulate the program. I think all of that is clearly illegal under the law, in my estimation. I think there will be lawsuits basically to flush some of this out. So I do think it's going to be a battle, unfortunately. I guess we'll have to see where those land. It kind of depends on at what level and what kind of lawsuit they might bring as a result of this. But, to me, this is really a way to supercharge charitable giving, and it won't have a lot of those pitfalls that, if this had been created as a voucher out of the Department of Education, which it is not, might have come with.
Yeah, well, I hope you're right. I have some real concerns, especially the pressure from the post-liberal right and their apparent willingness to not necessarily do things constitutionally and push some buttons, but we can talk about that on a whole other podcast. So, Patrick, we'll put the link to the article, and if you'd like the executive summary as well in the show notes. What else would you like them to know, or where should they go, and all those kinds of things? Where should they find you if you want to be found?
No, that's great. Yeah, you can check out our website is federationforchildren.org. And then, please, I encourage everyone to check out the new Education Freedom Tax Credit. You can check out AFC Scholarship Fund if you search that, but we're looking to build out capacity to basically help SGOs get up and running and be able to give scholarships to kids across school sector. So that's kind of the exciting next phase of the work here.
Okay. Any place that they should find you or you want to be found?
You can find me on X at Patrick Graff is great.
Okay.
That's about it. But yeah, I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thanks for the conversation. And as I often say, I hope it was helpful.
Yep. Thank you, Drew.